Let's talk about fasting in a way that removes pressure, confusion, and religious performance, and replaces it with understanding. Many people fast, but very few truly understand what fasting is meant to accomplish. And because of that, fasting has become one of the most misunderstood spiritual practices in the Christian faith. First, it's important to clear something up. Fasting is not a religious weapon you use to force God's hand. It is not a punishment you inflict on yourself so that God will feel sorry for you. And it is not a way of trying to change God's mind about something He has already decided. God is not manipulated by hunger. He is moved by alignment. Fasting is also not a seasonal ritual you observe just because others are doing it, or because it's expected of you. And it's not a spiritual badge you wear to impress people or prove how deep you are. Jesus was very clear about this when He warned against fasting to be seen by others. True fasting is private, sincere, and God-focused. At its core, fasting is a deliberate abstinence, from food, pleasure, or comfort, for a set period of time, with one clear intention, to realign your life with God's plan and purpose. When you fast, you are not trying to weaken God's resistance. You are weakening your own flesh so that your spirit can take the lead. Fasting is a spiritual posture that says, God, I acknowledge my limitations, and I need your intervention. That's why Scripture often connects fasting with humility. In moments when people recognized they could not help themselves, they fasted and turned fully to God. In times of danger, confusion, or overwhelming odds, fasting became an expression of total dependence. This is why fasting has always been connected to the supernatural. When you look through Scripture, you'll notice that fasting often precedes divine encounters, spiritual clarity, and unusual breakthroughs. Fasting creates alignment, sensitivity, and spiritual readiness to receive what God is already willing to release. Isaiah speaks of fasting as something that loosens spiritual burdens and breaks yokes. Not because hunger is powerful, but because fasting reorders priorities. It shifts attention from the physical to the spiritual. It quiets the noise of the flesh so the voice of God becomes clearer. Another important thing fasting does is intensify desire. When the body is denied comfort, the soul becomes more aware of its need for God. That's why fasting often comes with a deeper hunger for prayer, worship, and the Word. It amplifies desperation, not desperation born of fear, but desperation rooted in faith that says, God, you are my source. In Scripture, moments of national crisis, personal danger, or urgent need were often met with fasting. Esther fasted when the destiny of an entire people was at stake. Joel speaks of fasting as a response to the need for divine intervention. In these moments, fasting wasn't casual, it was intentional, focused, and prayer-filled. Fasting also disciplines the flesh. The flesh constantly demands satisfaction, comfort, and control. When the flesh is unchecked, spiritual sensitivity weakens. But fasting subdues the flesh, reminding it that it is not in charge. When the flesh quiets down, the spirit becomes dominant. And when the spirit leads, discernment sharpens. Another important truth about fasting is that it expresses human helplessness. It's a confession without words that says, God, I cannot do this on my own. That humility invites grace. Scripture shows that when people fasted sincerely, they weren't trying to prove strength, they were admitting weakness. Now, fasting must be done with understanding. You don't fast to impress God or people. God is not impressed by hunger. He responds to sincerity. That's why Jesus emphasized fasting without show. When fasting becomes a performance, it loses spiritual power. You also don't fast while counting the hours impatiently, waiting eagerly to break the fast. Fasting is not endured, it is engaged. The focus is not on when it ends, but on what God is doing during the process. Breaking a fast carelessly also misses the point. When fasting ends, wisdom should remain. The discipline of fasting is meant to reset appetites, not create excess afterward. Most importantly, fasting without prayer and the Word is simply hunger. Prayer gives fasting direction. The Word gives fasting substance. Without them, fasting becomes a physical exercise with no spiritual yield. In the early church, prayer and the ministry of the Word were prioritized alongside fasting. That balance is essential. Fasting does not replace prayer, it intensifies it. There are also seasons when fasting is appropriate. Sometimes fasting is initiated because God leads you into it. Other times, fasting arises from a deep burden for God's kingdom. A desire to see God's will established beyond personal comfort. There are moments when faith is challenged, when your life or the lives of those you love are under pressure, and fasting becomes a spiritual response. There are also times when fasting is done to seek clarity. When direction is unclear and decisions carry weight, fasting quiets distractions and sharpens spiritual insight. Scripture connects fasting with light and understanding, not confusion. Sometimes fasting is corporate, proclaimed among believers for a shared purpose. And sometimes fasting is simply part of spiritual maintenance, a way of staying spiritually alert, disciplined, and grounded. To truly maximize a fasting season, intention matters. Knowing why you are fasting helps focus prayer. Feeding on the Word strengthens the inner man. Prayer must be abundant, not occasional. Distractions should be minimized so attention remains on God. Listening is also essential. Fasting is not only about speaking to God, it's about hearing from Him. Often, instructions come during fasting because the heart is more attentive. And finally, fasting calls for restraint in speech. Silence creates space for reflection. Excessive talking during fasting can drain spiritual focus. At the end of the day, fasting is not about suffering, it is about surrender. It is not about starving the body, it is about strengthening the spirit. It is not about changing God, it is about allowing God to change you. When fasting is understood this way, it becomes a gift, not a burden. A doorway, not a struggle. A place where flesh steps aside and God takes the lead. When you're fasting, avoid distraction, dwell in God's presence because He's a king. If you have any question you can drop in the comment section. Like, subscribe and comment please.